Welcome to the fourth part of my series of presentations on Judith Butler's Performative Acts and Gender Constitution, an essay in Phenomenology and Feminist Theory. Part one was Sex, Gender, Feminist and Phenomenological View. The argument that Butler makes here is that gender and sex boil down to the way our bodies perform in space. The way our bodies act is the basis of sex and gender. And in order to do this, she draws on phenomenology. Part two, binary genders and the heterosexual contract. She discusses how by the time we learn how to perform these acts, let's say from the age of 3 to about the age of 16, we become so entranced and so impressed by our own abilities that we hide from ourselves as it's actually just a performance or an act. And it seems to us to be essentially who we are, that our performance becomes essentially real to us. And we find it off-putting or aggravating and even punish people who don't perform either the male or the female role accurately. Part three was feminist theory beyond a model of expressive gender. Here, Butler's trying to figure out what does her theory mean for feminism, and the news is it's not too good, because she finds that it doesn't really give feminists a manifesto, because she finds that she's denying woman as a category even exists. There's no essential women. There are no real women in the world. There are just bodies behaving in certain ways that are deemed to be masculine or feminine. So that's the argument. Now, what do I make of it? What is my impression? I'm an anthropologist, so I'm going to give you an anthropological perspective, just one anthropologist's perspective. I'll start with a brief summary. The idea is that there's no such thing as a female body. We get, even before a person is born, we throw a pink gender reveal. As soon as the baby is born, we dress them in pink, we pierce their ears, we teach them to act, or they learn to act demurely, to giggle in a certain way, to run in a certain way, to throw in a certain way. And all of this is just a result of our acts, teaching them and naming them and dressing them, and their own acts that gives the impression of a true woman, of a real woman. And we get this, we have a sense that this is an expression of an inner essence of that person. And it's the same for men. We make men out of bodies, our own acts, giving them a blue gender reveal, dressing them in blue, and so on. Now, the point seems simple at this level, but the way she ties it into phenomenology is quite fascinating. She makes a connection with the theories of Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, who say that the way our bodies operate in space actually constitutes our reality. It's not so much our mind making sense of the world, but our body being in the world that creates our reality. So it's a fascinating perspective to bring to feminism and what later, probably partly as a result of Butler herself, came to be known as gender studies in the 1990s. So there is an interesting tie-in, because anthropologists in the same period, in the 80s and 90s, were really fascinated with embodiment. There's a famous article called Lighting a Fire, where Michael Jackson describes how he learns through his body the importance of conservation by learning the technique of lighting a fire. There's an article by Helliwell who describes how the experience of living in a longhouse amongst the Dayak people of Malaysia can only be understood by focusing on the impressions it makes on you and your body and the senses in space. So it's quite a sensuous and embodied kind of approach to reality and approach to anthropology. And it draws on a long tradition of anthropology which looks at the habits of the body, or what came to be known as habitus, which is the way different classes and different people act in space. The famous example is that working class people are attracted to or develop a habit of, say, playing rugby, a tough, violent sport, whereas upper class men learn how to play tennis, which is more genteel and sophisticated. So it also brings in the idea of habitus or habits, bring in the class element. And all of these theories in anthropology are also focusing on the way bodies behave or the way certain classes or certain perspectives are performed in the world. As I've been recording these videos, I feel like I've been relying too much on an idea of knowledge of an inner essence. What I'm getting at is I think Butler herself needs a notion or an idea of inner essence to make her theory work. She's saying that we perceive or we understand that male bodies have an essence to them, a masculine essence, let's say, and female bodies have a feminine essence to them. But she's so focused on the bodily aspect that she doesn't really deal with the mental aspect. And that's really forgivable given that so much work up to the point when she publishes this in the mid to late 80s had been on ideas and so on. But given that she draws on different anthropologists, including Levi-Strauss and Victor Turner and Clifford Geertz, I feel like she could have actually delved deeper, particularly into Geertz, because Geertz would call this belief in an essence of an inner masculinity in men or an inner femininity in women as a form of religious belief. That is something that we hold on to extremely strongly without any evidence. Now, all cultures and all people have these kinds of beliefs, and mostly we don't even recognize them as religion. What I'm getting at is there's a belief, the belief in the inner maleness of men would be, according to Geertz, a form of religion. She could have used Geertz more effectively to make that point in her argument. Generally, I find in the article examples are lacking, and that's because I'm an anthropologist. I like people to point out actual examples from real life, and there's not a single real life example that I can recall in Butler's essay. There is a point that we punish people who don't perform their gender successfully, a male gender or a female gender successfully. And I believe that is a fair enough point. I think we can see enough evidence of that around. They would have liked her to actually make it more explicit and draw on an actual example, which is why I bored you with my example of sitting with my legs folded in Year 9 class, science class, when Peter and Mark turned and said, Nick, you're gay. Now, what she's saying to Peter and Mark, who are teasing me and saying, what she's saying to them is, Peter, Mark, stop teasing Nick for being gay. What you're relying on when you tease Nick for being gay is an idea that there's an inner essence to Nick that's masculine, and for him to sit with his legs folded in this way is feminine, and therefore you accuse him of being gay. What I think Peter and Mark would say is, Professor Butler, you're wrong. We're not relying on an inner essence. We can see that he's got like hair growing on his upper lip. We can see that he's got an Adam's apple. We understand that he's a man because of his body, but he's behaving like a woman. So their response is, we're not relying on some sort of inner essence, this belief in essentialism, that there's an inner essence to Nick that is masculine. So I'm not sure if Butler is really just presenting a different perspective or whether she's actually proven her point against them. It could be that she's doing what in logic, that element, that part of philosophy that's concerned with what makes a good argument, could be that she's affirming the consequent, that she's assuming that there's no division between male and female, that we make the division without proving the point. She might be doing that. On the other hand, maybe she's allowed to do that because she's not so much appealing to real-world examples as a completely new way to look at the world. So I think we can cut her some slack on that. And I don't think we really want to be sitting with Peter and Mark when we're doing philosophy. I think we're probably better off sitting with Professor Butler when we're trying to do philosophy. Still, I can't get past as an anthropologist, I can't get past the lack of examples. And I was trying to think why, but then I remembered before I was an anthropologist in the early 90s, as I mentioned, I was doing what was called, I think, women's studies or feminism back then in the early 90s. And I remember that there was the kind of writing we were reading, people like Jacques Derrida, Lacan, Who else was there? Levi-Strauss, particularly if they had a French name, we would read them. And Foucault, they didn't really feel like, particularly the first three, didn't feel like they needed many examples. In fact, there was a sense that smart people don't write with examples. So smart people just operate on a theoretical level. So perhaps that explains why she doesn't use examples. And I suppose as a young, intelligent woman trying to write for this audience in the early 80s, she would have looked dumb if she'd used examples. So she writes in a way that would have looked incredibly smart and still does appeal to me in 2025. But nevertheless, as appealing as it looks, I feel like the substance is lacking in terms of actual examples. And you might say, well, Nick, that's because you're an anthropologist, so you're looking for those. But in my defense, she is also using anthropological work, as I mentioned. She's using Levi-Strauss, Turner, and Geertz. So I think I have a right to ask for examples. Now, I think getting back to the theory point, potentially she's also, and this gets back to affirming the consequent. I'm going around in circles a little bit here, but I feel like she is potentially has her own assumption of an unsexed and ungendered body. She has this idea of a body that comes out completely neutral into the world. And that I don't have objections to, but I feel like in a way it's just as acceptable or as objectionable as the idea of bodies coming out with a sex. If anything, I feel a bit more sympathetic to her perspective, but looking at it from, I don't know, a logical or philosophical perspective, I feel like she has to do a bit more work to establish her point. In other words, she actually has a metaphysical point. She is saying that there's a kind of deeper reality that bodies are ungendered and unsexed to start with, which also needs a bit more substance. So I've got mixed impressions of this wonderful article. There are things I love about it, and there are things that I have problems with. But I feel that she's done a really good job, and some way it's like prescient. It's like she could see the future, that she realized that her work was not really going to be all that useful for feminists. And it's interesting now that as far as I know, some trans activists used Butler's work to further their own activism, which kind of makes sense because in Australia in the mid-2020s, there's still a little bit of debate between what you might call old school or second wave feminists who feel like feminism is for biological females and even view the trans people as not real women, people who transition from male to female as not real women. So it's not surprising that she saw that the problems that her own theory would have, at least for the second wave of feminism. Let's leave aside my argument that she's relying on an assumption that there are unsexed bodies. Let's leave aside that objection. At least there are some cases of intersex characteristics, people born with intersex characteristics. And it's obvious in those cases that these children or these babies are forced to conform to one gender or another. Like if their genitalia is ambiguous, doctors will normally force it to go one way, which is like the female private parts, or another way, like the male private parts. So these people are forced through acts of doctors and their parents to conform to one gender or another. So particularly in intersex cases, her theory is strong. But in general, like even if we allow Mark and Peter and let's say second wave or old school feminists to have their way, that there are bodies that are born male and bodies that are born female, even if we allow that, the idea of performance is really profound. The idea might be that, yeah, I got a male body, but after that, the way I perform is learned. I learn how to act or behave like a man over years and years and years, and I become entranced with this, and it seems uniquely real to me, and so on. Those points, I think, are still really useful. So even if my objections to Butler can be sustained, it doesn't really undermine the value of the theory. There's still a lot of value there. And for that, I'm really grateful. I think it's a wonderful piece of philosophy and a great assistance to understanding gender. So she's done a great job, and I hope you found my 3 presentations on her work useful. I'm not sure if my reflections are of value to you, but I did want to keep myself out of it for the first 3 presentations and try and explain Butler as much as I could in plain language in her own terms. And I suppose in the end, I thought it would be interesting to see what I make of it as an anthropologist. So I hope if this blog and presentation haven't been too useful to you, I hope the previous ones have. And thank you for sticking with it through 4 presentations.